Okay, so hi everyone. My name is Pritesh Raichura, and I'm the head of science at Michaela Community School. I'm really excited to be here, so thank you so much, Flavia, for having me on, and thank you to Seneca. Thank you to all the previous speakers as well. I've really enjoyed the talks, and I think part of what I'm going to be doing will draw together lots of the ideas from the other talks. So what I'm going to talk about today is teaching and lesson planning using explicit instruction. Now, I have to start by saying that I do not plan lessons. Now, that sounds controversial, even though my title is lesson planning. But what I mean by that is I plan units, or I plan a curriculum in its entirety. I think whereas before, there was very much a culture of let's teach one lesson at a time. It has a starter, a main, and a plenary. But learning doesn't happen that way. As Nikki said earlier in her talk, learning isn't linear. It takes quite a complicated route. And I think the way to think about planning, if you're using explicit instruction, is to think, what is the end goal? By the end of my unit, what is it I want people to know and to be able to do? And then the lessons that you have from now until the end of that unit represent a learning journey that pupils will take. And it doesn't have to be that you cover a certain amount each lesson, as long as you get where you need to at the end. And I think that's a really useful way of thinking about planning. So plan units, not lessons, would be the first thing I would say. But the second thing, at the other end of that extreme from big picture, is to plan your explanations. And those are the two main ideas I'm going to talk about today: planning a unit and planning an explanation. And I'm going to be modeling some of this as I go along, using the topic of electricity, which isn't my specialism, by the way. I am a biologist through and through. So do forgive me if there are any mistakes. I know there's a small percentage, 16% of the audience are physicists, according to Nikki's poll. So let's start by thinking about how we go from the idea that I want to teach electricity to going and delivering a particular lesson. So as I said, we want to start with the idea of planning a unit. And so it becomes really important to think about and have subject knowledge in its entirety. And what I mean by that is you as the teacher need to be clear about all of the ideas that are going to be forming part of your scheme of work before you start teaching your first lesson, because it means that you'll be able to then reference later ideas as you go along. The second thing to do is to then think about what are the main ideas in this unit. Think big, what are the big ideas, and you want to sequence them. So let's use the example. I've got little diagrams there. So you've got all your knowledge, you break it up into little chunks, and then you sequence them. So let's have a think about what that might look like. So in electricity, these are some of the ideas. We've got the idea of energy transfers, potential difference, current, etc. And once I've got my main ideas, I'm going to put them into a sequence that I think makes sense. Now, what are the kind of key principles I might use to sequence a unit? Well, first of all, ideas need to build on each other. It won't make sense if I start talking about current as the flow of charge if people don't know what charge is. So there's some sense of logical priority here where charge must precede current. And actually, when you do plan lessons using explicit instruction and you do plan an entire unit, you'll find that you change your mind lots as you go along, because as you start elaborating on a particular idea and you think, what do they need to understand before I teach current? You realize there's loads of things that they need to know about that will cause you to change your sequence as you go along. And your end goal should be, when a pupil is experiencing this unit with zero base knowledge to begin with, then what will they experience? How will their ideas build on each other carefully so that you're building really strong conceptual understanding and not embedding any misconceptions along the way? So sequencing an entire unit is really useful, but we mustn't stop there. So once you've sequenced your key ideas in your unit, you then need to take each idea in turn and atomize it. And this is a term I think that was coined by Chris Bolton. And What that means is to break down even that relatively big idea, although current isn't electricity, in a sense that it's a subcomponent of the topic of electricity. Current itself can be broken down into lots of different sub-ideas. Potential difference can be broken down into lots of smaller ideas. So the goal here is you want to take an idea like current, which you might think of as the rate of flow of charge. That's the definition of current. And you want to ask yourself, what knowledge do people need to know in order to understand that sentence, that definition of current? Because if you just get pupils to parrot that definition back to you, there's no way that you know they've understood that. You know, as someone said earlier, just because you've taught it doesn't mean they know it, doesn't mean they've understood it. How can we ensure they know what current really is? So you need to think, how can I break this down as much as possible? And part of this will involve scripting and explanation. So I like to write a script for all the explanations I'm going to deliver. We do this as a department. And it doesn't mean you're using the script to deliver in lessons, but the process of making a script does a couple of things. One, you're writing a perfect explanation. And as you go along, you think, oh, actually, there's a word here I've used the word rate, but I haven't explained what rate means. I'm going to add in a paragraph that explains what rate means. Oh, I've talked about flow, but I'm not going to assume that they know what flow means. How can I explain what flow means in the context of charge flowing, in the context of electricity? And so scripting is really helpful for the reasons that it helps you make everything explicit. And if you leave things for pupils to work out, like, oh, they'll figure out what flow is, then there's a risk that you're excluding some students from your class from accessing the understanding of that idea. The second thing it does, you can share that explanation with pupils. And I know that we had a speaker earlier talking about booklets and textbooks, and that's really what we do at Michaela, which is we offer those scripted explanations to pupils so they can refer back to them, because my explanation will be transient. It will be gone once I end the lesson and once they're at home going over this stuff. So having access to it is really helpful. They can annotate it and answer questions from it, refer back to it. So some of the questions that come up when I atomize current: what is rate? That's the word in that definition we need to explain. What is charge? What examples are there of charge? Concrete examples are superior to abstract ideas. If you keep talking about charge, but the pupils don't know lots of examples of what you mean by charge, then what are they imagining? Do they have something tangible they can think of when you say the word charge? That's what you want to make explicit later on when you're giving your explanation. Where do the charges come from when electricity is happening? Where are the charges? What are they? What does it mean for charge to flow? What does it mean by a big current? How is that different from a small current? So my process of planning here is that I'm thinking and breaking down and atomizing this idea of current into the smallest constituent parts. And I can do the same for potential difference. So potential difference might be defined as the energy transferred to or from every coulomb of charge. And perhaps you're already thinking, okay, I need to start defining the words within there. You know, what is charge again? What is a coulomb? Where do charges get their energy from? Because we've got the word from. And what does it mean for charge to transfer energy? Because you've got to and from. So you're atomizing, you're breaking down the idea into smaller and smaller parts. And then your next step is, how can I make all of these ideas explicit to my pupils? Oh, even more questions there. Where is energy transferred to and from? Okay, so I've talked about starting with a big picture, breaking that down into big ideas, sequencing those, and then picking each one apart and atomizing it so you know everything you need to make explicit to your pupils. The next thing I've kind of lumped together because they all feed into each other. So next, what you want to do is you want to now start writing that atomized explanation. Think about the examples you're going to be using. As I said, examples are more concrete and they help pupils to really grasp onto an idea. Because for example, I used a particular example of electricity here, so you know what I mean when I say atomize a topic. If I just said to you, atomize a topic, break it down, every single person listening to this talk will be trying to think of their own example and trying to apply what I'm saying to what they think I'm saying, and they might not come up. There might be a whole range of ideas that everyone ends up leaving the talk with, but by providing an example, it was really clear to everyone what I mean by break something down and the extent to which I mean to break something down. So that's why examples are so useful. We can't think in abstract terms. We can only think with examples. Diagrams are really powerful, and anyone who has perhaps read any of my blogs, I blog at bunsenblue.wordpress.com, will have seen that I've shared lots and lots of examples of dual coding or diagrams that I've used, and I use as part of my explanations. And diagrams aren't always appropriate. Sometimes what might be appropriate is a worked example for a calculation, or a model answer, or some model sentences, if it's something that pupils need to practice articulating. Linked closely to explanations inextricably are the questions that you ask during your explanation. If you're not asking questions during your explanation, you don't know that feedback loop isn't there. So you're giving examples, you're giving non-examples, which I'll come to in a moment. But I could keep talking and talking, and in a way, one of the limitations of giving a talk like this is I don't know what everyone else is thinking. I don't know if people are understanding what I'm saying. And what makes a classroom where you're using explicit instruction so useful for the teacher is you then test out, do you understand what I'm saying? Ask specific probing questions, and you get the feedback from the pupils. But I'll talk about questioning in just a moment. We've got examples and non-examples. I've talked about diagrams, and I'll talk about questions in the next slide. What I don't do in my lessons, and something that I used to do and I've stopped doing completely, are the following things. Complicated analogies. Now, analogies are hugely useful. I'm not saying don't use them. That's why I specifically wrote complicated analogies. In fact, most of electricity really is some sort of model. So it would be foolish of me to say I don't use any models or analogies, but it's about complicated analogies that I don't use. So when I first started teaching, I used the Oompa Loompa, Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory model of electricity, where the Oompa Loompas would go and collect chocolate from the factory and go and take it around to the different components and drop them off, and then go back empty-handed to collect more. And I think that that's distracting. And I think that for me, it doesn't work, because I find that actually, and you'll see when I explain hopefully later on, that some of these ideas are straightforward to understand. And an analogy could overcomplicate them further and just be extra things for people to think about, when actually if someone doesn't know what Oompa Loompas are, they have to first learn that, then apply it to the analogy, then apply it to electricity. It's unnecessary cognitive load. I don't do activities. By that I mean pupils aren't getting out of their seats and physically modeling these things, because I feel that pupils are thinking more about where they are, what they're doing, rather than what that should represent. They don't have the same vantage point as you standing to the side observing the entire circuit, because they're immersed in the circuit, moving around. And I find that often means that the teaching of electricity it slows down the teaching. So whilst it might be effective, I think the clear explanations are more effective than activities. And for similar reasons, I don't use group work, and I don't do practical experiments until after they know the theory well. What about the questions? The way to think about planning questions, and I'm going to talk about, and I'll show you lots of examples of the kinds of questions I ask my pupils, is to have a really clear direction that you're taking the pupils in. You as the teacher, having planned your unit, you know the end goal, you know the destination. So as you give your explanation and pupils respond in a particular way, you need to react to them and think, they've got this misconception, I'm going to try and tackle it and bring it back to the destination I want. Constantly, your questions should force them to think about the content, to think about the ideas that you want them to think about. And every decision you make about your teaching, because explanations have to be reactive. I loved what Nikki said about the eyebrows raise when you're given an explanation and a kid is sitting on the front row going, I don't understand. They don't have to say it. You can just see it on their face, and you can ask them a question and react. And that's what good responsive teaching is. So you might think, okay, I need to use more examples. Oh, I need to use a different question here because they've gone off on a different track here, and I need to bring them back. You might pick certain pupils who you know might struggle with this, have struggled with ideas like this before, and if they get it, then that might be a useful inference to make about more people in the class understanding it. I use 4 main strategies for questioning, and I won't go into detail about how I use them here, but I'll reference at the end where you can find out more about this. Call or response, something like, what do we call the rate of flow of charge on 3? 1, 2, 3. And you'd expect the whole class to shout out current. So you give a clear signal, a short answer, and you expect everyone to say it in unison. I use that a lot because it's really energizing in the room. Cold calling, so that means you pick pupils who don't have their hands up, really useful. Turn to your partner, really quick. Turn to your partner, tell your partner what current is, go. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, hands up. And you pick someone, you cold call someone. So really rapid use of oral rehearsal is really helpful. And mini whiteboards, which I think is self-explanatory. Okay, I'm now going to explain, do my little live explanation. I'm going to switch to my visualizer. So let's see if this works. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I will switch to my visualizer. Okay, I hope you can see that.
Yeah, we can see that.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay, great. So, I mean, I've got a very simple definition here, which is current is the rate of flow of charge, but I've got that there as a way of, we'll come back to the idea, the definition again and again. So first, as we said, I need to establish that my pupils have understood all of these different component ideas. Remember when I atomized the idea earlier? So I've got the idea of charge here. First, we need to check that my pupils understand what charge even is. So I might say something like, right, this would be earlier in the sequence. I might say, can you remember if I tell you something is charged, how might you describe it? And I would hope that they'd say something like, well, either something can be positive or it can be negative. If I say to you, something is not charged, how would you describe it? You might say something like it is neutral. That means it has no charge. So making really clear with you need to establish that pupils have understood this. Then you might say, okay, so can anyone give me any examples of things that have a positive charge? And you'd hope that they might say something like protons. Now, I wouldn't ever ask this if I haven't taught them what protons are. This is me, remember, thinking about, I'm halfway through my sequence. We've talked about charge, we've talked about atomic structure, perhaps even. So protons, they might even say something like metal ions or cations. Negative, they might say electrons and anions, and I'm going to just speed through this because I don't want to spend too long on this. And for neutral charge, we might have something like neutrons or just atoms and not ions. So I say, right, so we know what charges can either be positive or negative, and we've got some examples here. Then I might say, again, thinking about depending on where we are in our sequence, assuming this is a Key Stage 4 class, and assuming that they've already looked at something like metallic bonding, I might ask them, can you draw for me a diagram that represents metallic bonding? Again, this is a bit of retrieval practice for them. I'm assuming they already know this, but if they didn't, I might simplify it and say, okay, imagine I've got some sort of wire, and in this wire, I have lots of electrons that are inside my wire. If all of these, first of all, are these examples of charge, yes or no? And again, that's a really simple question, but I'm just checking that they understand, because in explicit teaching, you make everything explicit. How do I know that this is a charge? Oh, because it has a negative charge. Good. Okay. Now, if I tell you that these are all moving, in a particular direction like this, they're all moving in a particular direction, I can say that they are flowing. I can say these electrons are flowing. And it's really important to think about those ideas one by one. So we've got the idea of charge, and we've got the idea that they flow, by which I mean they move, but not just move, but they're moving together. So I might say move together in a particular direction. And that is what we mean by current, when any charge, like electrons, move together in one direction. Now, I might also have, in fact, what I should have started with is some concrete examples. Said, look, we've got this visualizer, it's got a wire connected to it. When you plug your phone into the charger, there's a wire there. You might have your TV plugged in. Those are all examples of electricity in the home that you might find. And they all have wires. In particular, those wires have copper inside them. And the wires have these electrons that are able to flow. They move together. Now, when you switch off an appliance, then the appliance doesn't work anymore. We know that from experience. So why is that? And then I can use a kind of non-example. I can say, well, when I switch off my appliance, what's happening is, and now again, depending on if I'm teaching Key Stage 3 or 4, my explanation might change. So if I'm aware they know about metallic bonding, I might say to them, well, this is a sea of delocalized electrons. We know about this from our chemistry unit when we looked at metallic bonding. The electrons are still moving around, but why is there no current? How is this different to this? And I can point and I can really clearly contrast my example and non-example. And I can say, well, look, they're not all going in the same direction. And so I can't really say that my charges are flowing or moving together. And so whilst there is a current flowing here, there is no current flowing when we switch off our circuit. And what I'm doing here is I'm helping my pupils have a really concrete idea in their heads of what it means when you switch on a circuit for current to flow. So I've got the idea of charge and I've got the idea of flow. And again, I'll be asking lots of questions along the way, as I said. But we still haven't got to the idea of rate. And so we can start to break down the idea of rate. You might use other examples. Now, I think by this point in my teaching sequence, they would have come across rate before, rate of photosynthesis, where they would have measured the number of bubbles per minute that a plant produces, bubbles per minute. Or they may have seen speed, which is the rate at which you're moving, measured in meters per second. And so I would perhaps go back to those examples and say, you remember this, we've looked at rate before. And actually, what rate is just any unit. So it might be the number of bubbles. It might be the number of meters divided by time. And that's what we mean by rate. In other words, it's a measure of how quickly something happens. So if we go back to our idea of current, we can start to think about how quickly these electrons are moving. So if I imagine I've got a little checkpoint here like this, and my electrons are going to move past my checkpoint, I could ask in 1 second, how many electrons will go past? So let's say I start my timer, and after 1 second, this is how much the electrons have moved along. I can say that there are 4 electrons that have moved past that 1 point in 1 second. If the current was larger, then I would have a higher rate of flow of charge. I might find that in 1 second, I get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 electrons. And so because my electrons are moving more quickly, the rate of flow of charge is higher, and therefore my current is higher. And I would then use that as a way of introducing the equation where we talk about current as being, I mean, I know I haven't explained what coulombs are, I know I haven't explained what the symbols are yet, but I'm giving you a sense of later on where this would end up is I equals Q over T. But I just wanted to give you a sense of how the movement of charge in one direction is really important. Now, one thing I want to highlight here is how I'm giving my explanation. I'm drawing live so that people can follow. as I introduce each thing, I'm giving a really clear explanation. I'm checking they've understood every component along the way. What is a charge? What is an electron? Where are the electrons? Oh, they're in the wire. What kind of bonding is there here? Metallic bonding. In metallic bonding, if the current isn't flowing, which direction are the electrons traveling in? Oh, they could be going in any direction. If I switch that circuit on, what's happening to the direction of flow of those electrons? Ah, they're going in one direction. And it's that level of breaking things down that makes explicit instruction so powerful. But clearly, what's important here is you're using their answers. And obviously, I can't hear what you're saying or thinking now. And in a class, it would be more responsive. I would be responding to the answers. And if the pupils aren't getting it, I'd think of different ways of explaining it. But I would have planned my questions because I've planned the extent to which I am atomizing my concept. Okay, I'm going to go back to the video and share my slide again, just to wrap up. Right, so finally, I want to talk a little bit about independent practice. And I just had some examples. So after this explanation, I will then send them off and say, right, answer these questions in your books. And I have planned a series of questions. Now, you want to tackle the same idea from different angles. And what I mean by that is, if you just keep saying, what is current, what is current, what is current, and they keep telling you rate of flow of charge, rate of flow of charge, rate of flow of charge, they're not getting anywhere. They're not making much progress other than parroting a definition back. But if you then flip that around and say, what is the flow of charge called? Current. Specifically, it's the what of flow of charge. Oh, it's the rate of flow of charge. Or the other example I've given here is give an example of a charged particle. And then later on in the sequence, maybe 6 or 7 questions later, you might ask, what are electrons and cations examples of? And you're flipping the question in this way, getting them to think about the same idea from different angles. Progress from simple to complex questions. I think that's straightforward. Make links to previous learning. So you might then link this back and say, what makes metals good electrical conductors? And they might link that back to metallic bonding. And that's more of a challenge question that will be later on in the sequence. And rehearse ideas. And I think using sentence starters is a really good way. So not just asking questions, using sentence starters can really help you get them to articulate that idea as well. Okay, so as you can see, I've put 3 arrows here because I wanted you to show that you might, after teaching, you might then go back and say, next year when I teach this, I need to atomize this even further because, gosh, there were lots of misconceptions. But I hope that you can see that by spending so much time thinking about the planning of the questions and the atomization of the concept, I've left with such a richer knowledge of how electricity works. Whereas if I was planning activities for my pupils to do, like role play and posters around the room, that kind of stuff, then a lot of my time is spent thinking about the resources I'm making and the post-it notes I'm handing out. And I don't have the headspace to think about my subject matter in much detail. And I think part of the benefits of explicit teaching is that as a profession, we can really reclaim the idea that becoming a master of subject knowledge is really intellectually stimulating, and scripting explanations is really interesting, and it helps you to unearth misconceptions. And I think that's one of the most beautiful parts of teaching, is understanding why pupils go wrong, as Nikki said, and trying to excavate through lots of questioning what it is that the problem is and how you as a teacher can help your pupils bridge that gap. So if you want to find out more about some of the things I've said, similar to what I've talked about here, I've written a chapter in the early career framework handbook. I've also given 2 talks linked to teacher talk and teacher-led lessons, which are both on YouTube, on the Research Ed sections of YouTube. So one is Research Ed Home and one is Research Ed Norwich. I know Engelmann's been talked about today, but lots of the principles I use here, and the same with Rosenshine and his principles. And there are lots of resources for practice and good explanations and blogs if you follow at CogSci on Twitter. And they have a website and a mailing list I'd recommend you join. So I hope you enjoy that, and I'll now take any questions that anyone may have.
Hey, thank you. That was great. Great use of technology and visualizer and slides all at the same time. Great. So we have a few questions. So in the beginning, you were talking about scripts, and they wanted to know if you script as a department or individually, and if it is as a department, how long does that usually take? How do you actually do with the other teachers?
Great question. So we do it as a department because we write in-house textbooks or booklets. And a booklet is essentially a series of clear explanations written out with diagrams that we scan in and lots of questions for people to answer. They take a very long time to make. It takes hours and hours, hundreds of hours of work.
Yeah.
But we work as a department to do that. And over the course of time, we've built up our resource bank. And what we do once we finish delivering a unit together is we come back and we have a meeting to evaluate what worked well, what didn't work well, what diagrams did you come up with that weren't in the booklets before. And if we as a department agree it would be useful for everyone, we photocopy them in and modify our booklets year to year. So it takes a long time to do. And if you're someone who's interested in doing it, I would suggest just picking one unit to begin with, working on it with the teachers of a particular year group, and starting and having that as a starting point. And it might be in the first booklet I wrote, I had some sense of my big plan, but actually lesson to lesson, I was writing a script with questions and handing it out. And then I put all the individual documents together in a booklet. So it doesn't have to be the perfect thing to start off with. Definitely it's trial and error.
Yeah. And then I think you mentioned that, but how often do you revisit and change and improve and refine those booklets?
Yeah, constantly. So I think after every time it is taught, and sometimes it might be in the context of another booklet. You might think, oh, actually this booklet links well to this one, and I might change the analogy I've used or the explanation I've used because it matches this booklet better. So it is a constant process of revision.
Yeah, nice. There was a question from Emma that I think was an interesting one. So she really likes the idea of planning a full unit, but then she's thinking that that's probably good for an experienced teacher. She's thinking about a new teacher who's just starting, early career teacher. How can we help them
That's a
do that?
really good point. I think that, as I said at the start, it's really important, even if you are a new teacher, before you teach a new unit, to have a really good overview of the entire unit. And so make sure your subject knowledge is secure for the whole unit. And that means that before you teach your first lesson, if it then means if you are responsible for creating resources on your own, then you can still have a better shot at it than learning things as you go along. But I would say in an ideal scenario, I think, I think new teachers shouldn't be planning entire units on their own because, as you said, the experience is so useful in knowing the misconceptions, knowing the pitfalls, knowing how explicit you need to make something. I think it needs to be a collaborative effort, and having the help and the support of colleagues is really essential there. And that's why subject communities like CogSci-Sci are so helpful.
Yeah, totally agree. Usma just asked if you have different booklets for different groups of students, so differentiated booklets, or if you use the same ones and then each teacher will do them in class.
Yeah, so we use the same booklets, but there might be entire sections that we either put into a box or we italicize that are more trickier concepts. So it might be a foundation higher thing, or it might just be conceptually something that's really tricky that you wouldn't even want to touch unless your class has mastered the other things. So we have kind of guidance within the booklet that allows for differentiation. In an ideal world, perhaps you would have separate booklets, but as I said, they take such a long time to plan that I think we give, the teachers have autonomy to deliver the lessons how they want, but they're using the booklet as a framework to go off. So the sequencing is done for them. There is a model explanation there if they want to use it, but of course they're encouraged to add their own examples and to add their own practice questions to suit their classes.
Yeah, perfect. And Avelina asked, when you were doing the live planning, if you write out the questions before you have the class, so during planning.
Yeah, so definitely I would recommend writing out your questions. What I often do is, if I have, I don't normally write on scrap pieces of paper. I write in an exercise book, and on my exercise book, on one page, I have my diagrams that I might have pre-drawn or that I will draw live. But on the other page, which is hidden because it's not on the visualizer, I have all my questions that I've written out. And so as I draw something, I'll say, right, my first question is, what is a charge? You can give me an example. And I have scripted my next question. Now, it doesn't mean I stick to that script necessarily, because I'll be responding, but I think the more times you've taught a topic, the better you are able to be responsive. But I would definitely say planning the questions on one side and keeping your diagrams for show under the visualizer on the other is a really good way of making sure that you don't lose track yourself and you have a clear sequence of questioning. And I think it's really helpful, because you can see it live and the kids don't know you're looking at a script, and it's helpful to have those questions there for you.
Yeah, that sounds like a good plan. I think we have time for the final question now. I'm just going to read what Morvan wrote, which is that I've seen many teachers use teacher textbook spreads to plan lessons. So one double page equals one lesson, either for ease of planning or due to lack of subject specialism. How could they be supported to gauge the pace of lessons and amount of content to cover within one lesson, like you said, with the fluidity that comes with your unit planning approach?
Yeah, I mean, it is tricky. I think time is a huge limiting factor in the science curriculum for sure. I would say that if you are using the most efficient ways of teaching possible, so like I said, when I used activities, they would take such a long time for the pupils to do, and it would result in for the amount of time the pupils are spending doing the activity, there's not much learning happening. Whereas when you have clear explanations and rapid questioning between you and the class, it does mean they master ideas more quickly, in my experience. But on the other side, when you break something down so much and you make sure they're mastering each bit, it does take longer. But I think overall there is a trade-off there. I think that where possible, trying to use homework efficiently as well. So if you want to set a lot of the independent practice for homework, and then get them to bring it in and do whole class feedback afterwards in class, that might be a way to save time in lessons as well. So you're spending the time they have in front of you to really make use of your expertise as a subject lead in that room, and deliver the explanation clearly and check understanding and unearth misconceptions. They go away and do their practice at home, come back, and you can feedback and check they've got the answers right. And I don't even mean you have to mark it. You can then just go through the answers, they self-assess, and then you can say who got the following questions wrong. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They put their hands up, and if they're number 4 and number 7 are the ones where most kids put their hands up, you can then reteach that. So that's another way that you can perhaps save some time.
Yeah, sounds good. Very good ideas. Thank you so much, Pritesh. We're out of time, but I want to thank you, and I want to thank all the other speakers. I want to thank everybody who joined us on a Saturday morning, especially the speakers for giving up their Saturday morning for doing this. Thank you very much. That was great. We were trending on Twitter, so yay, well done, Team Science. And yeah, thank you so much for attending, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.